Did anyone not get their practice test from yesterday? All right, this is just a basic little review, and it's very generic, but I thought it'd be something just additional to help you out with, especially this last little bit. Thank you, Tom. And in fact, I have all of these now. They have one for the entire era. Okay. They will not erase my board. They refuse to erase my board. And so we have to go from there. Yeah?
Did we ever get those DBQs back?
Oh, I got to hand those back. I mean, I handed them back, but then
Took them back.
yeah, then took them back, and they're sitting in your basket over there. Okay, so let me do that while I talk. All right, we finished with unconditional surrender, right? And why did Roosevelt say unconditional surrender for the Allies? Now, when I was a kid, when I was a youth, many, many years ago, I remember my teacher, in fact, this was in college too, they said, Churchill, who was much more savvy of a politician, which of course is simply not true, you're not going to find anybody more not savvy than Franklin Roosevelt. Churchill was appalled because this would make the Germans fight how? Yeah, much harder to the finish when they know there's not going to be terms. As awful as World War I was, there were terms. They agreed to go home, they gave up their navy, that sort of thing, of the armistice. And so they thought if they fought harder. This, of course, is simply not true. They talked about it. They planned it. Now, this is going to be problematic. Because once you commit yourself to unconditional surrender, you can't go back. Even though at places, especially the Allies, with at places like, I'm going to say, in Brittany in 1944, they gave terms to the troops guarding the ports there. You know, they made certain agreements, even though, of course, they had to surrender, but certain agreements. But they're stuck to it to the very end. This would encourage Germany to fight harder, and more importantly, they stuck to it in the Pacific. And even the Japanese War was much more of a territorial war, a war for empire. Now they're stuck with totally finishing off Japan. And the whole issue was the second front. Sicily, they invaded first, and Churchill called this the soft underbelly of Europe. What Churchill believed was, let me erase this and also hand these out as I go. What Churchill believed is they thought they could avoid the casualties of war, they could invade up in Italy or invade through Yugoslavia and go into Germany this way. That somehow that would be less bloody. But if you know anything about the terrain right here, that's patently ridiculous. You got 14,000-foot cliffs here. Can't fight there. It was silly. And Italy has a mountain chain right down the middle, the Apennines Mountains. Beautiful. That's why it's such a big deal for wine. Mountain slopes are great for vineyards. Now, see, you've learned now a little horticulture. You're welcome. But very difficult to fight there. And so, after Sicily fell and Mussolini surrendered, they very hastily, the Western Allies, did an invasion of Italy, and then they were bottled up south of Rome, and they would spend the entire winter there. And this is something that the rest of the countries had learned. The Russians learned the hard way in Russia in 1941. I don't know if you know this, you might want to write this down, but in November it gets cold. And it continues to stay cold until about April. No, we're not talking 50. I know, I've just blown your mind. Yeah. But what happened was they were totally unprepared. The Americans, it was a disaster. They didn't have warm weather gear. Well, they had warm weather gear. They didn't have cold weather gear. They didn't have boots. They didn't understand trench foot. It was a disaster for American forces. And the only reason I mentioned this is because they learned quite well. It was a worse disaster in 44 when they were right here. I didn't realize this, but 1 out of every 4 American casualties in World War II was trench foot. I knew it was high, but Italy turned out to be a disaster. And talking a little bit about the American forces. You know, Russia always is kind of ignored of what happened on the Russian front, but the Soviets did defeat the Germans, but I do not want to take away from what the Americans, the British, and the Canadians did later on. But the whole point was that they had to open up a second front. And so, in 1943, the Western Allies met in Tehran. Tehran, Iran. Well, actually, the British were so called Persia, Iran, tried to call themselves Iran. Tehran. The big three met there. Who were the big three?
Great Britain, U.S.
And who was, for Britain, it was, of course,
Churchill.
U.S. it was,
FDR.
and
Stalin.
when they met there, who came late?
Stalin.
Stalin, of course.
Stalin.
Yeah, I'll make them wait. He always showed up late. Bill Clinton always showed up late, too.
He's probably coming from the fair.
Okay, so when they arrived late,
I did not have sexual relations.
oh, you got two.
Thank you.
When they arrived late, what happened was, when they arrived late, that was where the decision was made to do a couple things. But the first big decision was that they would, or the Western Allies did finally agree that they would attack France and open up a second front. But this is actually crucial. When they actually said this, Stalin, who had been demanding a second front, was furious about it, said, well, you can wait.
Because he was late.
Yes. 42, he's desperate. 43, Italy's not bad. And that's when Churchill, who was always opposed, said, okay, we better go. And that was a decision, I mean, that formally decided decision that they would attack in the West. And so, the plan was made for an attack in France to open up the second front, and this would be what we call, well, the attack is going to be in Normandy, which is right here. And the reason they attacked here is because it had a long beach, and since it's a little bit further away from England, it won't be as heavily defended. Right here, at a little harbor town called Calais, which had been British all the way up until about the 16th century, Calais was only 19 miles away, and the Germans put unbelievable defenses there. And so they knew they had to go someplace else where there was a long beach and still in range of fighter planes. They couldn't attack here because it's swampy. It's just very logical. And so they had to attack here. And this would turn out to be, at least up to that time, arguably the biggest amphibious operation in history. The reason we say arguably is because in the Pacific in April of 1945, Okinawa was attacked, the island there, and in some accounts that was a bigger attack. It all depends how you figure it out, how many men. So we're talking a titanic operation. Now, when the Allies invaded here first in Africa, then in Sicily, then in Italy, what did they call that day they attacked? D-Day. Because what does D stand for? Day. Day. It's just the important day. H-hour? Hour. Yeah, that's the attack. You know, it didn't mean anything. But, except for signifying the day, so this is D-Day. But this would be such a big invasion now, that is D-Day. That is the D-Day. And so if you go to France, they call it Debarkment Day. Essentially, when they landed, they try to give some kind of special name. No, it has no real special meaning, except for, of course, that D-Day. And originally it was going to be May. What happened?
The net one. Net one.
Now the Western Allies now are desperate to get into a fight. They knew there's going to be a billion. The pickety panic. I could read that another time. They knew there would be real massive supply problems. So it's always going to limit the number of troops they could send. So the big thing they had to capture was ports, try to figure out a way to get supplies over as quickly as possible. And I'm going to go through this very quickly, but reluctantly, The British allowed an American, very political general, never actually been in combat, Dwight Eisenhower, to be the overall commander. Britain had to do that because the Americans were going to contribute, especially by the summer, the bulk of the forces and the bulk of supplies. Britain, and we're going to talk about this in just a second, Britain had limited resources because of their size, and they used almost half of their resources for heavy bombers to attack Germany. They were desperately short of men and equipment, so they had to use American equipment. So they had to accept an American general. But the commander of the actual invasion of itself would be a British general, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who was a very good general who the Americans hated. Eisenhower put it best. Eisenhower said Montgomery would be the greatest general to fight under. He would be a hard general. He would be a hard general to be a peer with, and he's impossible to command. Or later on, Eisenhower would say he's a psychopath. There were some disagreements between the British and the Americans. We'll leave it at that. Now, we can't go through all the details of the invasion. Originally, it was going to be in May. But weather and the lack of landing craft pushed it to June. And so, June 5th, 6th, or 7th would have to be the days, and because of weather, it would be on June 6th, 1944. And this would open up the second front. It worked for a number of reasons, but the biggie we have to get to. In fact, the big reasons is that the British did an amazing job convincing the Germans that they would attack here. It would be a month and a half after the invasion, in July, and the German High Command was still convinced that Normandy was a diversion, and they were going to attack at Calais. That's how successful the Allies were at convincing them they would attack there. They made up fake armies, fake radio transmission. The British, because they had the Enigma machine, knew all the German spies in England and turned them. They made them a deal they couldn't refuse. Bullet in the back of the head, or you become a counteragent. And guess what they did?
You got a bullet in the back of the head.
And they'd give them just little tidbits of true information, usually like a minute after, like when it was just too late. And so then when they needed them, they all reported that this attack here was a diversion, and the Germans fought it completely. It worked brilliantly. Pretty clever. The British are really good at this kind of stuff. They like this kind of intrigue.
Hence James Bond.
Yeah. Well, Ian Fleming. Yeah. And so, the attack took place on June 6th, and I cannot go through all the details of the offensive, but let's just put it this way. There were 5 beaches that they codenamed, and there were 3 beaches that are British and Canadian and American, gold, Juno, or sword, Juno, gold, and they were relatively easy. The American beach on the far side, Utah, they just codenamed it Utah, relatively easy, but the beach in the middle that they knew the Germans would defend the most, because it's in the middle. You hold the middle, it splits up the attacking force. That would be the hard one. And that beach, the the High Command, Montgomery, nicknamed Omaha. Omaha Beach. If you go there today, it's a nice sandy beach. In 1944, it was rocks and pebbles. They bulldozed it. When they're trying to get supplies on shore. And that would be the most difficult beach. And the Americans had this by just the very nature of where they were positioned in Britain. It wasn't because they wanted the Americans to do it or thought they were better or worse, but it just happened to be the bad luck for some of those Americans that they had to attack at Omaha Beach. And as the other beaches were relatively easy, Omaha would turn out to be hell. For an hour and a half, the men were pinned down on the beaches, and it looked like there's no way they're going to get off. And then small little groups infiltrated up the cliffs, and they were able to hold a tiny beachhead at the end of the day at Omaha, which was the hardest fighting. They were able to capture it. They expected about 1 out of 3 casualties, and it turned out to be significantly lower. And so D-Day was a success. Yes, I'm going through this very quickly. I will go into more detail about it because we were talking before Mr. Long in special topics. D-Day was a success, and that would open up a second front. And this would be decisive. Even though still 60% of the German forces were here fighting and being crushed. In fact, while D-Day is going on, that's what Operation Migration was. I mentioned yesterday, this titanic operation that the Germans would lose 500,000 troops. It's hard to even comprehend that. Yes, they were running out of men. All of you guys would be gone. Yeah, I'd be gone too. We'd all be gone. Fighting and probably not very happy about it. We'd be fighting Cossacks in Poland and not enjoying it.
Some of those guys seem happy about it in the video.
Maybe not 44 so much. Maybe in 41 when you're winning. 44, all you had to say is someone at the Russian front and Germans would start shaking. And this would be a different style of fighting. The Germans who fought in the Russian front that were sent there to stop the Allies were like, they don't even know how to fight in the West. It was a war of annihilation in the East. In the West, it was at least kind of with rules of war. And what happened is, slowly but surely, the Allies built up forces. 130,000 men landed that day in Normandy. And they're just piled on top of each other, because where do you put all the supplies? And my grandpa landed about 9:30 that evening at Utah. Mr. Long's dad, he came about a week later when they were forming the Armored Division. Mr. Long, the math teacher upstairs, they're forming Armored Division, so he was in a 2nd Armored Division. And so, with that, for the next month and a half, there would be very intense fighting in the forests here of Normandy. And the Germans committed everything they could to stop them right here. And that is actually key, because in August of 1944, Montgomery's plan actually worked, even though he was so arrogant, no one wanted to talk to him about it. In end of August, the Allies broke out, and what happened next rivaled what happened in 1940. The Allies broke out right here. And not only did they surround and kill 150,000 Germans right here, the Germans broke. They're all here, except for stomach troops who are defending the fortifications here. Stomach troops are soldiers who either had digestive ailments or had been wounded in the stomach and couldn't fight regular combat. They put them in fortifications. They're in fortifications. They love, the music. It's going to the background. And the Allies broke out, and the Germans literally ran as fast as they could to the German border. The rest of France fell in 2 weeks. I mean, just take it. And when that happened, the Allies also did an amphibious invasion here, and in the southern France, and very quickly, the Germans here fought. Basically what they do is they try to blow up the harbors, and then they ran this way. And by the end of August, the Allies were right here. I mean, France just, boom, liberated. And 1 million French soldiers immediately joined the forces which were necessary for victory. But what happened was on the Western Front is they ran out of supplies. They had to drive the supplies from the beaches to the troops here. And I think you can probably guess what's going to happen. They literally ran out of gas right here. Similar thing happened to the Germans when they attacked Russia. The Russians did these titanic operations, and part of the reasons why they would advance 150 miles to stop is supply. Then you got to bring up supply. That would be key. And so by the time supply got up there and they opened up harbors, winter hit. And it was hell on earth. The winter of 44-45 was the coldest winter on record. It's like a cruel trick, isn't it? And so it's, what was it? What would it be by then? Almost 2 million American, British, Canadian soldiers, and then 1 million additional French soldiers are right here. The Germans were able to use the winter to hold on to their line. Remember, we mentioned this before a couple days ago. They constructed what's called the West Wall, a line of fortifications. And even though they kind of abandoned them in 1940 after France fell, they're still there. The German eye for defense, which was so proven in World War I, was still very good. And the Allies beat up against this. And this is where Eisenhower made probably his worst mistake. What they should have done is hunker down for the winter and wait for spring. But what did Eisenhower have them do? Kept attacking. And the casualties were ungodly. One division, the 28th Infantry Division, was one of the two divisions that landed at Utah Beach. They're a Pennsylvania division, so they had a little keystone symbol for Pennsylvania that was red, so they were called the Bloody Buckets.
That's awesome.
Their replacement rate, meaning the number of troops they had to bring in to replace those who were killed, wounded, or missing, from D-Day to the end of 44, their replacement rate was 315%. That means for every one person in that division, they would eventually need 3 more replacements. That's how high their casualty rate was. And who's getting killed? The quarter of the men that are in the infantry. If you're in the infantry in World War II, you are going to be killed or wounded. There's pretty much no way around it. My grandpa was in the Signal Corps, but he was wounded. Mr. Longstaff was in armor, but he was armored infantry. Actually, he was in a reconnaissance unit. He was wounded. We'll see that. Did he bring in that camera film? I can't remember if he did. Well, I want to tell. I don't know. Can't take special topics. Mr. Longstaff had some pretty amazing stories. But the point was, the casualties were appalling. But of course, they're worse for the Germans. The Germans are literally out of men. In fact, what they were doing is, the police, they're at the front. There's the police in the front. All of us would be at the front. I would probably be your commander.
Oh, God.
Yeah, oh, God. And so I would just have you circle me.
We're all dead.
Actually, regardless if I'd be good or bad, you're probably right. And even though the American forces had a severe lack of training and horrific equipment, should not have had good equipment, but they didn't prepare for the winter. The men had mostly summer gear all winter. They just put layer after layer after layer of stuff on. It was amazing how bad that was. And for all the supply situations, it turned into a battle of attrition. Just slaughter on the Western Front. And that is when Hitler would make his last gamble. A foolish gamble, but last gamble. The Battle of the Bulge. And once again, I'm resisting the urge to tell you more about this as much as I'm interested in this. But as the Western Allies got right here, what Hitler thought he would do, this is the border of Belgium, once again attack through the Ardennes. Remember he did that in 1940? And remember the 28th Infantry Division, the Bloody Buckets? They were decimated, attacking in the forest right here. A foolish attack. Foolish attack. With these outrageous casualties, they put units like that in the Ardennes so they could rest. Or there's a unit called the 106th Infantry Division. They were literally fresh from North Dakota. They're North Dakota National Guard. I mean, they literally got off the boat, got on the trucks, and they just stuck them right here in the forest. And so the Germans thought, if we attack there, break through, and go get the key port of Antwerp, which is the biggest port in the world today. It's in Belgium, this huge port. Well, it's them in Shanghai. It's a competition. Let's go back and forth. Yeah, Antwerp's just huge. But that was the main Allied port. Cut them off. Perhaps the British and the Americans realized it's folly to try to fight the Germans along the frontier, and Hitler honestly believed that the Western Allies will see the light and join Germany in the crusade against Bolshevism.
Got that word down. Like he uses the word crusade.
Yeah.
That means
The problem was, he did predict that there'd be a lot of people upset, or a lot of people in the West upset and worried about what's going to happen with the Soviet Union. But he was delusional. And so that was the attack right there. And the attack was going to take place on December 16th, 1944. Why December 16th? I'm sorry, December 16th. Why then? Yeah, winter, and that would keep the Allied planes on the ground. And they initially broke through and created kind of just a little advance here, and that's why it got its distinctive name, the Bulge. But a few Allied units, few American units, held the cities, did little tiny towns in the Ardennes that didn't allow the Germans to advance quickly, especially the 101st Airborne held a little city called Bastion, held that, was surrounded and held out. The German offensive basically ran out of gas, and the Allies counterattacked. And the Battle of the Bulge would turn out to be the biggest American victory of World War II. The Battle of the Bulge destroyed the last remnants of Germany's reserves. Now, we did not know it. I mean, in January, they're going, oh, God, the Germans are going to keep fighting. This will never end. But Germany was done by January. I mean, they were going to lose. But now, this hope was in Germany. We can hold out and make it so bloody along our frontiers. Now, no chance. The Battle of the Bulge finished them off. And I do got to tell you one story about the Battle of the Bulge. The 101st Airborne Division was surrounded, and the Germans demanded their surrender on the 20th and the 21st. There's the Panzer Layer Training Division. And they sent word over basically saying, we demand your surrender or there'll be unnecessary bloodshed and civilians of Bastion will be killed. And General McAuliffe, who's the commander of the 101st Airborne, he's actually the second in command. The commander was back in the U.S. where he's in command. He got that, looked at the message, it was on, nuts. And the guys, and his adjutant said, that's how you respond. What? No, what? You didn't even know what he said. Just write down nuts. So his response on a piece of paper, nuts. And the German's like, what does that mean? Is this positive or negative? And he goes, it's negative. And so they brought that back, nuts. And so if you go to Bastion today, this pretty little town in the forest, all over it referenced nuts. They call themselves nut cities now. I know it's pretty funny too. So there's like this cafe in the main square called the Nuts Cafe. It's pretty funny. But I would go. And in fact, we used to have this hall of documents. Here's a surrender document. This is the original. I don't know how I got it. For the Japanese surrender. And here it is. The Christmas message from General McAuliffe to the 101st Airborne. And it goes through, kind of briefly explains it from McAuliffe, and then the reply, nuts. And this is the copy of it, Bastion. And so I'll pass this around. This is pretty cool. It's one of those things, this is what I do. I had to go to make the pilgrimage to Bastion. And it's a really neat city. And that is when we went to this Belgian restaurant. And Belgium, there's they're big into sausage, and they had the yard of sausage, and someone ordered it next to me, and it was a yard of sausage rolled up. It was this long. That was really fun. Okay, so moving on. Yeah. Is that about a yard?
Yeah, a little bit more.
I can't tell. When you're like, all right, so back to this. But one of the things that Germany was having problems, remember total war. Remember how the British went through the Blitz, terror bombing of the cities. Well, that's what the Allies were doing to Germany this whole time. This was called strategic bombing. That's another word for total war, strategic or long-term. And the goal was twofold: to knock out valuable German industry, so it's total war, but also do what to civilians? Terrify, destroy it. And that is what the Allies were doing. Beginning in 1941, the British began bombing everything they could. And they did it at night. Now, they couldn't hit anything at night, but the losses were so heavy during the day. And they would lose 50,000 men, air crew, bombing Germany. but kill hundreds of thousands of German civilians. Because at night, and the hell of night bombing, oh my God, the crews had to go through, it was amazing what they had to do. And because they had the shortage of pilots, they didn't have a co-pilot. And so I'm thinking, you think about flying 7 hours, one guy. They were tough men. They bombed at night, and they called it area bombing. They just would bomb a neighborhood. That's all they could do. Bomb an area, hope they hit some factories, but if not, kill as many civilians as possible. They bombed at night. And in 1943, they bombed Hamburg. Now, Hamburg's one of the biggest cities in Germany, still a big city. That is awesome. It's just awesome. Yeah, I sent a postcard to my dad from Bastion. It's kind of a cool thing. And the postcard, it was just nuts city. And it's really funny, especially when if you don't know why. Those Belgians. Okay, so, but Hamburg, they did the first major firebombing, where they used white phosphorus and gasoline bombs. Pre-napalm. Napalm's coming. The United States would invent that the next year. You know what napalm is? Jelly gasoline. That it will, once it ignites, as long as there's oxygen, it will burn until it runs out of oxygen. White phosphorus burns, same deal, as long as it has oxygen, but it's a little more expensive. And the British sent 400 bombers to bomb Hamburg using almost all incendiaries. Well, the first bombers carried big bombs they called cookies that would kind of create a little bit of wreckage, and then they dropped fire bombs. This created the world's first man-made firestorm. In one night, over 40,000 civilians were killed in Hamburg. And they would do other ones at a smaller scale, but by the way, if you don't know what a firestorm is, imagine how you get a fire. As it starts heating up, as it sucks in more oxygen. Well, as it heats up and sucks in more oxygen, the fire gets hotter and needs more oxygen. So it sucks in even more. And pretty soon it gets kind of burns in itself and kind of will spread like this out. It'll go 300 or 400 feet up in the air, then burn out, catching more things on fire, requiring more oxygen, getting hotter and hotter. Pretty soon it burns at 1,000 degrees. And it sucks in oxygen at over 100 miles an hour. Sucks it in.
That's just like
yeah. And people in their shelters, huddling in their bomb shelters, they might have survived the initial bombing and they would be asphyxiated as it sucked out all the oxygen. That's how intense this fire was. The world's first one. Remember what I told you about in the Blitz when the Germans started bombing and they killed tens of thousands of British civilians? The British would get them back many times over. Revenge. The United States tried to bomb during the day. The United States had more heavily armed planes, had a lot more pilots, so there could be 2 pilots on the plane and go through a bit of the stress of flying it. You might have heard it. The United States had an incredible plane they fortunately made before World War II started called the B-17. It had the great name, the Flying Fortress. It had 16 50 caliber machine guns for protection. It didn't quite work the way they thought. And all through 43, they lost so many aircrew. Almost 50,000, actually 48,000 American aircrew would die. And they only did it for about 2 years. It was a bloody affair. A bloody affair. And it didn't work. It didn't work until 1944. Everything changed because the United States made the best plane in the war. It's called the P51 Mustang. And the B-17, the P-51, the British used a Lancaster. Only reason I mention the Lancaster because Mr. Sims is subbing today, and I got to say something that was made in Canada. They're good planes. There's a Lancaster museum south of Calgary. I'm full of tidbits today, aren't I? And what happened, why I mentioned the P-51, is that the P-51 Mustang was an American-designed plane with a British engine. It was an Allied affair. And it had great range. It could fly from Britain to Berlin and back and fight over Berlin. it could escort the American long-range bombers. And so what happened is the Germans sent up their fighter planes and knocked the American bombers down, and now they're fighting up against the best plane of the war. And it just chewed them up. It shot down so many German fighter planes that they had to pull fighter planes from the front to defend Germany. And that meant the Allies had air superiority. The P51 was a decisive weapon, the greatest fighter plane ever built. And with that, by the end of '44, the Allied bombers begin to have effect. They quit going after industry and they went after the oil facilities. The Germans didn't have oil supplies, so they're having coal gasification factories. Yeah, I said I need a little more time to finish. Coal gasification facilities, and what happened is by the end of '44, the Germans were literally out of oil. They were out of oil. They were dangerously low of oil when they invaded Russia. But the Battle of the Bulge used up their last reserves. And so by January of '44, Allied bombers just simply bombed every city in Germany. Smashed them. At first, it was kind of selective because they still had some German opposition. And they're still anti-aircraft guns. But they knocked them out. City by city by city. And the British kept saying to the Americans, you can't hit a factory. Let's kill more civilians. And the Allies finally agreed. And in February of '45, they firebombed and destroyed Berlin. Destroyed it. Killed over 40,000 civilians there too. If you go to Berlin today, Berlin's really flat, just really flat. And there's these big mountains. There's 3 of them. They're kind of weird. There's one in the zoo. There's one outside of town. It's just, why is there a mountain? It's just like, it's all the rubble. They just piled it up, covered with dirt. And it's there. Now there's a hill. And then they turned it to another city that they hadn't bombed yet, Dresden. Sorry, that's an E. Dresden, right here. And Dresden, they firebombed again. The British bombed at night, and the Americans bombed in the day.
It was just constant bombing.
Constant. And at Dresden, 125, anywhere from 80 to 125,000 people. We don't know how many people died at Dresden. No idea. Because you have all these people fleeing the Russians. And so Dresden was an evacuation site. And so there are people everywhere. Dresden would be leveled. And they still found bodies. When I went to Dresden in 2008. And they were still rebuilding it. They're still fixing it today. And when I was in Berlin before we went to Dresden, and there's a story in the news that they just uncovered 4 bodies in Dresden from the bombing in February 1945. It all collapsed, they built over the top, they were rebuilding, found these 4 bodies. When I was in Berlin too, they found an unexploded bomb.
That'd be scary.
It was, yeah, it was just all over the place. And so what happened is, if you go to Germany today, there are very few cities that are not rebuilt. Especially whether it's combat, like Cologne or Berlin. They're just destroyed. Aachen, the beautiful city of Aachen, where Charlemagne was crowned, destroyed. Yeah.
Did they just abandon any cities?
They rebuilt them. When the Soviets occupied it, it was a matter of pride for them. And for the Western Allies, it was, we're going to rebuild them as much as possible the way they were before. So you go there and see a building, oh, I feel like I'm going back into the medieval wonderland. No, it was all built in the 1960s. To look like 1400. Berlin, or like Munich. Munich is like a hodgepodge of remnants of old and then new to look like the old. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. And so, with this, Germany would be defeated. Once March hit, the Allies on both sides attacked. It took about a month to break through. And in April, the British, the Americans, Canadians, and French finally broke through at the Rhine, and the Germans broke through the Russians broke through to Berlin. And Eisenhower decided then that Berlin would go to the Soviets. Berlin would go to the Soviets. And in the last really big battle, it's in one of the biggest battles in world history, the Battle of Berlin, where you have the Soviet armies attacking the remnants of the Germans. And because Hitler did not want to panic the people, he didn't want to imply that they were losing, did not allow for full fortification of Berlin. And so the defenses of Berlin were really a hodgepodge. And you have fanatical Nazis fighting alongside people like us. I mean, literally just thrown into a uniform and fighting with no training, fighting for the Germans. And you have mighty Soviet armies. And they simply laid waste to Berlin, building by building, brick by brick, block by block. On April 30th, 1945, Hitler, with the Germans only, or the Soviets only, less than 200 yards from the entrance to his bunker at the Chancellery, which is no longer there anymore, committed suicide. He took poison and put a bullet in his head to make sure. He was really worried that the poison would degrade and be flopping around in agony. And Germany would fight on until tomorrow. The anniversary is tomorrow. On May 7th, 1945, Germany, well, at first they tried to just make peace in the West. And no, Montgomery and Eisenhower made it very clear, you're going to surrender to the Russians, too. And on May 7th, they agreed to surrender. The fighting ended on May 7th. It's the anniversary. In fact, this is going to be a big deal in the Ukraine. I can't help it. It's the Ukraine. Get over it. In the Ukraine, that's the day that was in Russia they celebrate, and in the Ukraine, when the Germans were defeated. That could lead to some issues. It's already blowing up. That's a big day for the Russians. The Great Patriotic War, we won. And they would surrender. So the actual day would be called VE Day, Victory in Europe. And technically it's May 8th, even though May 7th is when the fighting would end. And that was as fast as I could do on that. And even though Berlin was captured by the Soviets, it had already been decided, I'm going to go through this very quickly. Tehran, they met in 43. While the fighting is still going on, the Western Allies, the Big Three, met one more time, and in January and February 1945. So while this fighting is going on, they met in Yalta. Yalta was chosen by Stalin. It's in Crimea, the Crimea. It was a resort town, but the fighting in the Crimean was awful. 41, when the Germans took it, they laid waste to it. And then in 43, when the Soviets took it back, it was laid waste to. And Stalin wanted it there, a little bit like what Clemenceau wanted after World War I. You're going to look what happened to our country. Yalta would be the last meeting of the Big Three. And now, this one is one of the most important and controversial meetings in history, because it's here when they decide the post-war world. The post-war world. What they're going to do with this, which is a disaster area. Well, they decided a number of things. And one of the first was the decision for a UN, a United Nations. They'd been talking about this. Let me make it clear. It's not like Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin said, we should have a UN. Great idea. You know, they had their own ambassadors and emissaries setting it up. So what basically they went there to approve ideas. That's really what happens in these kind of meetings. Rarely do you have one of these meetings where all of a sudden they all just come together and, hey, let's have a great idea. Okay. So the United Nations. And the United Nations would deal with the problem of collective security and that issue this way. The United Nations would have a Security Council of 11, now it's 15 members. They would make all the key decisions, but there would be 5 permanent members of the Security Council, and all 5 have a veto. And therefore, if there's any action that one of those 5 don't want, they can't be compelled. The veto would go to the 4 great powers, well, actually kind of 3 great powers, and then got to give it to France, because they're going to be, once again, a great power. And then Roosevelt was desperate to have something to kind of balance against Japan and the Soviet Union in the Pacific, so one went to China. So Britain, U.S., Soviet Union, China, and France.
Taiwan.
And then it would eventually go to Taiwan, then it would eventually go back to China. Now, do you see the problem with having a veto?
Can't get anything done.
Nothing is ever done in the United Nations. The United Nations cannot do anything. If it's controversial, one of the 5 powers vetoes it. And last thing for today, I know the bell's about ready to run the deal with it. And also, one little interesting quirk about the United Nations. Stalin said, we have the General Assembly, which has no real power, but of all the countries, Britain, France, and the United States will always vote together, and I'll be outnumbered 3-1. And that is unfair. And so they gave the Soviet Union 3 seats in the United Nations. Soviet Union has 1, Ukraine has 1, and Kazakhstan would have 1. I just thought that was one of those strange little quirks. Really? When it turned out, the General Assembly can do nothing. Votes in the General Assembly have no meaning. But they still did that. The United Nations started out in San Francisco, and then they would eventually build a beautiful new headquarters where? Jordan, Montana. In Jordan, Montana, of all places. Few people know this, but Mr. Hageman. You know Mr. Hageman? Yeah, he was actually a delegate for 14 years in Jordan. He's from Jordan.
Was he representing the U.S.?
He was representing Jordan. Not Transjordan, not the Jordan, no. Jordan, Montana. People know that Jordan has a veto. Oh, everybody, bring your list tomorrow. The review list tomorrow.
You record the class.
You're asking way too much out of me. Well, now, which test is tomorrow? I know you've told me, but calculus. Calculus tomorrow.